Book of Joshua today. Joshua in your Old Testaments, if you haven't been with us, we're doing a Bible survey, I guess we can call it that, taking one book in the Bible a week and just obviously hitting the highlights. You know, you got about 30 minutes to cover an entire book of the Bible. You're not going to be able to talk about everything, but what we're endeavoring to do is to give a brief outline. And these are books probably you've studied through before, maybe on your own or in a church somewhere. But it is advantageous at times, and again, we take times to slowly work through the text, and that's something we need to do, but sometimes it helps to just back up a few steps and kind of take the story as a whole and how all these pieces fit into that picture that God is putting together of redeeming His world. So we're going to endeavor to do that. Of course, Joshua, right on the heels of what we call the Pentateuch, those were the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Books of the law, it's referred to in other places. Not that those first 5 books are all law. They're not. There's a fair amount of it that is. But they're the books of the law because it's within that part of the biblical history that God gave the law to His Old Covenant people and started the process of what He intended for that to do. So as Deuteronomy ends, as we saw last week, the children of Israel, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness on the other side of the Jordan, are now poised to go in. And Moses in the book of Deuteronomy is rehearsing the law of God, and then has some personal warnings and blessings in the last few chapters there for the people, because as we talked about, Moses wasn't going to be able to take that final step of leading the people in due to some sin on his own part. He would die before that happened. And Joshua, of course, was Moses's right-hand man or protege, trainee, whatever word you like to use there. Executive officer, right. There you go. COO, or that'd be EO. Anyway, Joshua is going to be the one to be the leader of the people, to take them in to the land that God had promised. So the book bears his name. Not that he wrote it, but perhaps he did, but someone recounting the history of the people of God at this point, probably somewhere around, and I meant to look this up yesterday and then I got distracted with something else, but I want to say this is going to be in the 1400s BC, or before Christ, some 14 centuries before the Messiah showed up. That was when they left Egypt. 1406 is the number that comes to mind, whether that was they left Egypt or anyway, somewhere in that time frame is where we're at chronologically here. A brief outline of the book of Joshua. I've just got 3 points here. First of all, chapters 1 through 4 speak of the process of entering the land, right? Again, you've got the Israelite nation poised on the east side of the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River there. Of course, the land of promise was on the west of Jordan. I mean, it extended into the eastern side a bit with 2.5 tribes, but the bulk of the land was between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, and from roughly Egypt up to the north. So, but some preparations had to be made for these to take the people in, because again, this wasn't all going to go easy. Remember, there's people living in Canaan. And they were going to have to fight for the land that God had given them, and God had promised to help them through that. But that's chapters 1 through 4. Then in chapters 5 through 12, the last part of the first third of the book, if you will, is the story of the conquest, conquering the land of promise. And then chapters 13 through 24, the end, is primarily speaking of the process of dividing up the land of promise. Now, you will recall, I'm speaking here of the land of promise. This goes clear back to Genesis chapter 12 and the early verses there, where God promised Abraham and to his seed to give them a land. all right, a physical land. And we're reading the history of God fulfilling that promise, and we'll see that before we're done. In fact, the word land is the theme that I've chosen for Joshua. It's all about the land, and we'll see that as we look through a few of these points. Just let me start here by mentioning Joshua chapter 11, verse 23. Joshua 11, verse 23 says this, "So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war." And that, again, in one verse is pretty much a nutshell of everything that happens in the book. That's why I kind of chose that as the theme verse. And it wasn't just Joshua. I mean, Joshua as the leader is credited with the task, and that's why it says Joshua took the whole land. Joshua and the people were involved in all of that, and of course God as well. But let's look at any questions over that before I ramble on into something else, by the way, I guess. Give you a chance. Maybe something. There you go. All right. Well, thank you. I'm good at that at times. All right. Anyone else, though? All right. Let's just, again, why would I choose the idea of land? Because it comes up over and over again in the book, and the book reminds us of some things about this land project. First of all, the land was a gift from God. Right away in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, it says, and this is God's charge to Joshua is the heading in my particular version. Let me just read verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all the people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses." All right? And that just emphasizes God right in the first 3 verses is telling the leader of the people, this land is a gift. All right? I'm giving it to you. Or I have, it's interesting, the text there, God says, I have given it to you. And it's always neat to read when you're dealing with someone like God who has the ability to execute His plan without any flaws, that it's as if it's a reality already. They're yet to go in and do what God calls them to do, and we're going to see before we're done today that they don't fully do what God called them to do anyway, and there's going to be trouble for that. But this is a gift from God. It's emphasized over and over again. Verse 11 says, Joshua says, "Pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, saying, Prepare provisions for yourselves, for within 3 days you are going to cross this Jordan to go into the land to possess which the Lord your God is giving to you to possess it." And again, verse 15, chapter 2 verses, there's 3 or 4 places in chapter 2 and chapter 8 and chapter 18. Over and over again, it's emphasized this land is a gift from the eternal God. Number 2, the earlier generation, of course, failed to see the land because they didn't listen to God. Part of these early chapters in Joshua, God, through the writer, reminds the people that, and I think He does so to, again, prepare them to be obedient from here on out. The earlier generation, again, didn't get to go into this gift from God because they didn't pay attention. Chapter 5 and verse 6 says it this way. Joshua 5 verse 6. "For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is, the men of war, who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that He would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey." And that's speaking primarily, again, of that, when it says the men of war, that would be the men 20 years old and upward, it says in other places, that were, because they didn't go in initially when God told them to do that, there was a price to pay. There's always a price to pay for not listening to God. It may not be as severe as happened here, but there's consequences to ignoring the Lord. Okay.
I want to say Proverbs 10 Proverbs. There's a way that seems right to a man. We're all familiar with it.
Sure.
There's a way that seems right. And when I think about my personal self doing something, I think, hey, this seems right. But God says, but it leads to destruction. You know, you think you're doing the right thing. And that ought to scare the crap out of us. You know, we do something and think, oh, I'm good.
Yeah, you need to bring God into the equation somehow, right? It isn't like we need to cower in fear for stepping out in faith and trying to do some things, but be guided in that process by what God has to say. Jim? Okay. Yeah.
Right. How I treat my enemy. Go out and do a good job on it.
Right. Okay. So again, it's more, perhaps we could say it this way, is we're emphasizing here the importance of listening to what God has to say in a matter, but it's a willingness also for a heart that's changed into what God wants you to be in doing that. Okay. Good point. Mm-hmm.
Well, I do know I've got a job, I've got to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. All right, let's reemphasize another thing here. Again, the land was a gift from God. The earlier generation failed to see the benefits of that because of an unwillingness to listen to God. We also see in the book, again, from what we read this in verse 23 of chapter 11 a minute ago, we see that, again, it's stated in the past tense. So Joshua took the whole land. That's looking ahead in history here yet. But this is an important point to reference here. The whole land was taken, and we'll see that in the last few chapters. And I only bring that up for the sake that there are still religious philosophies popular today that says that God hasn't ever totally fulfilled that command to give them the whole land, so God has yet to do that. You know, Jews en masse will have to go back to the land of Israel. Now, God says very clearly in this book that He fulfilled that promise. God did exactly what He said. But sadly, and this is the human element here, you also see in the book of Joshua that the land wasn't totally possessed. And I'm not saying possessed in the sense of a evil possession, but God told them to go in and take the land. Well, the people of Israel weren't totally successful in that, not by God's fault, but they were to totally move out everybody, and they let some remain, and that proved to be a problem. Chapter 13, verse 13, chapter 15, verse, I know I'm giving these quickly, you can just jot them down or get a copy of the notes later. Chapter 16, chapter 17 mentions the fact, but they didn't quite drive out everybody, something to that effect. And that's going to come back to haunt the people of God. The land, of course, we see, again, was divided, that last half of the book, basically, and this is one of those sections that can get kind of tedious when you're doing your daily Bible reading, if you're doing that. I'm in the process now where I'm just finished up 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and boy, that's another dry section of the Old Testament in a lot of ways. But there's a purpose in recording these things, and there's a purpose for talking about the land being divided as God told them to do that. So they took the time to do that. Not one tribe got the whole land. There were 12 tribes, right? 12 sons of Israel, and the land was divided up. Some groups got a bigger chunk, others got smaller, but I believe the wording used, was divided by lot. There were lots drawn, God guiding the process, but the land was divided. We also, again, and this is what I was referring to a moment ago, God fulfilled all his promises concerning the land. And again, you might say, well, duh, that's obvious, but it is important to note this because you'll run into a lot of very well-meaning religious folks that say, oh boy, this is yet to happen in history. Well, notice what God says about it. By the time the dust settles in the book of Joshua, chapter 21, verses 43 through 45, it's almost, I can't read God's mind and how he inspired all this to be written, but it's almost like God wanted to put in these 3 verses just to nail this down for someone who may come along centuries later and says that God's yet to do something he promised here. Well, listen to how it's put. Joshua 21, starting in verse 43. So, this is right near the end of the book, so the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers. And they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not one, I love this phrase, it's almost like God says, if you didn't quite get what I just said about me fulfilling my promise here, he says, and not one of all the promises, or not one, well, let's get it right, I can't see the text, and no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Okay. God does what he says. Amazing. Amazing. God keeps his promises. There's no excuses here given by God. God says, I did it. I promised you. And there were some rocky times in doing this, and there's was some prices to pay for them not quite fulfilling what that says, but God, again, the dust settles, it was done.
A big part of this country's foreign policy has been based on prostitution.
Yep. Yeah, again, if you're wondering, what am I hinting at here? It's this whole, basically it's premillennial dispensationalism. That's a couple of big $25 words, but it's the idea of the physical temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt like Solomon's temple, and the Jews have to return to that physical land before God's process can continue. Basically, they would say the age we're living in is just a Band-Aid to get to what God is going to do because he didn't get it done the first time. I just shake my head when I hear that kind of thing, and maybe it's just because of my raising. I wasn't raised to believe all the other, but yeah, this isn't Plan B. But as Jim's pointing out, yeah, this idea that that God has yet to fulfill that land promise. A lot of political decisions are made in our country over the. Sure. And there's repercussions from that. Yeah. There's prices being paid because of that false understanding, misreading of the Bible. So, but again, I don't know how God could have said it any clearer here. I did it. I fulfilled all my promises that I made there. All right, then finally, as far as the theme here about land, it comes up over and over again. God reminds them, Joshua through God reminds them right near the end, because Joshua in chapters 23 and 24, the last 2 chapters of the book, is at the point here, several years has gone by in this process. Joshua now is facing his own death. And he's doing what a good leader like Moses did, taking time to speak to the people he's been leading, reminding them of some things. But one of the things he says in chapter 23, verses 12 through 16, listen to his warning here to the people. He says, this land that God has given you, that has taken such a price to possess, Joshua in essence says, you could lose this through disobedience. And ultimately that turned to be pretty prophetic, because Israel was driven out of the land later on because of disobedience. Here's how Joshua says it. Verse 12 of chapter 23. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, see, there was part of the problem. They would have drive out the Canaanites completely. They didn't do it. But he says, if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations which remain among you and intermarry with them so that you associate with them and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you and a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Now behold, I am going the way of all the earth, and that's just his way, Hebrew way of saying I'm getting ready to die. And you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word, here he says, God says it again through Joshua, not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you today has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. It shall come about that just as all these good words which the Lord God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from this good land which the God has given you. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and you go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from off the good land which he has given you. And again, that came to pass historically. Israel continued as time went on. When we get into the book of the Judges, we're going to see one example of that the people were taken, not in Judges, but later on, taken into captivity. They were driven out of this good land, not because God didn't want them there, but because they weren't paying attention, worshiping other gods. That's a no-no. All right, quickly, some lessons I think we can think about from this book. Sure. Yep. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay.
Or food, or housing, or anything. My point is, I think we're all susceptible to changing our allegiance.
Sure.
In Psalms 50, verse 20, I think,
Okay.
God says, you think I look like you?
Yeah.
That's paraphrase.
Sure.
And he said that over again in the Old Testament. You look at me and you think I look like you. You think you're like me. You're not. I'm the God. You're just, it doesn't take away from the honor and glory of being God's creation. We're not God. And when I try to make something that I want into something God wants.
Yeah. Just because we're not physically bowing down to an idol doesn't mean we're not worshiping other gods. Yeah. So whether it's possessions or whether it's some other person or anything can take the place of God if we let it. Approval, yeah. Even our religious ideas, we can worship that. So.
Just real quick, it was Proverbs 16:25.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the way it seems right. And like you're saying, people worship God in different ways. They think they're doing okay, and ask they to by you. They didn't end up too well.
Check what God has to say in every matter. If if he has something to say about it, then it's best to pay attention. All right, let me run through this list of some lessons that maybe you can think about more this week. We learned from the book of Joshua that faith and obedience are inseparable. Chapter 6, verse 20. And then in Hebrews 11, verse 30, the Hebrew writer looks back at the very events here of taking the land as an example of that. Faith and obedience are part of the, I read a book here some time ago that, faith, we may have, probably the original readers of this understood the concept better than we do today because we've somehow kind of got this idea that faith is just a mental process. believe certain things and then we're right with God. Well, we have to believe certain things, but belief that isn't linked to acting in certain ways is incomplete. And we see that here as well. Joshua warns them. We also learn that the sin of one person can affect the entire group of which he is a part. And if you're familiar with Joshua, you know that's that's the story of Achan, right? They were to go, Joshua was, my version says, put under the ban. God says the first city they went in to conquer in the promised land was to be totally destroyed, no spoils taken from that. Well, Achan thought better of it and took something for himself and hid it in his tent. Well, as people learn throughout the scriptures, and usually proves true in our lives, you can't hide something from God. He was found out, and not only did he pay the price, but in a sense, the whole nation suffered because of that, and his own family. So think about that next time you decide to do something that God wouldn't want you to do, that this may affect someone more than just me, you know. All right, another lesson. Failure to consult the Lord in decisions can lead to problems. That's chapter 9. There's a story there in which some people that were part of those to be conquered played a ruse on Joshua and the people of Israel and came like they'd come from a far distance and they weren't residents of the land. So Joshua went ahead and made a pact with them to protect them. And lo and behold, he discovered that they were some that should have been taken care of, but he didn't want to go back on his word. And part of the lesson that's highlighted there in chapter 9 is, he didn't consult the Lord in that decision. That's going to be, you got to be careful about that. This lesson we've talked enough about probably, but I just want to mention it again. God is faithful to his promises. I harped on that quite a bit a little while ago, but that's a lesson that carries throughout Scripture. If God has promised you something, and again, you don't want to go willy-nilly through the Bible and see any promise there is made to you specifically or me specifically. It's not. But if a promise is made to you or I, then, or if God makes a promise to someone else, he's going to keep it. Not going to go back on that. We learn from the book of Joshua that judging another's motives can lead to misunderstandings with grave consequences. That's a story in chapter 22. And won't take time. You can read that later, but that's the overall lesson there. There was some judging done there that there was some misunderstanding. People made some decisions, and there was consequences from that. And then the last one on my list here, Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15. This might be a memory verse that if you ever studied the book of Joshua, this might have been one that comes up. It's a famous couple of verses. That's right. Joshua 24, starting in 14. Again, Joshua's at the near end of his life. He wants to say something important to these people. But notice what he says. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth. But he goes on to say, and put away the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Which tells us what? They'd left Egypt and apparently carried along some of the gods, little idols that they worshipped. Hadn't totally been devoted to God, but anyway, Joshua says, put them away. Then in verse 15 he says, if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Again, I just titled that, God doesn't want fence straddlers, right? Choose a side, Joshua says. Don't try to pretend that you're serving God, but you're hiding the idols in the back of the tent. Again, God knows we can fool each other, but God, again, choose, make a choice, and serve it. It reminds me of the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, right? He kind of says the same thing to that group. Make a choice here, folks. Important lesson from Joshua. Closing comment, any thoughts?
I think it was Paul. I marvel that you are so soon removed from the
forget, truth
I
maybe.
marvel that you are so soon removed from
Okay.
and then Christ Jesus to another
Yeah.
God. Not that there is, but there's some who would have you believe that there is. Anyway.
And that's again, that's a warning for us in the sense of
That difficult.
be driven away. All right, take some time this week if you can carve out a little bit to take a quick look at the book of Judges, and we'll see what we can learn.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.